Hello, I'm Anthea Hancox, the CEO of the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute, and we are delighted to bring you this special limited series of our Voices of Australia podcasts. As always, this podcast was recorded on the land of the Kulin Nation's Wurundjeri people, and we pay our deepest respects to elders past and present. I am welcoming you to the Scanlon Foundation Research Institute's new 6-part limited podcast series, Truth, Trust and Politics, a podcast that explores the complexities of truth, trust and political communication as we approach the 2025 federal election campaign. From mistruths and manipulative tactics to the erosion of trust in political communication, this series unpacks the dynamics that shape modern politics. We'll ask critical questions: who stands to gain from misinformation? Who's most vulnerable to its influence? And most importantly, what can we do to clean up our discourse and rebuild trust in our democratic processes? Featuring community thought leaders, politicians and policymakers, journalists and researchers, we'll explore the role of truth in shaping voter perceptions, the impact of social media, and strategies to counter the growing influence of mistruths. Join our guest host, Mary Gearin, award-winning journalist, MC and facilitator, as we examine how misinformation and the decay of trust impacts social cohesion, who it affects most, and what we can do to foster a healthier, more informed democracy. Mary's guest for this episode is Jon Faine, former lawyer and veteran ABC Radio Melbourne broadcaster. They'll have a wide-ranging discussion about mistruths, news consumption, and the global trends that are amplifying misinformation to wrap up this series.
Jon Faine, thanks for joining me.
It's a pleasure. What a lot of fun we can have.
We will have a lot of fun. I'll start you off on this. Do facts exist anymore?
Have facts ever existed?
Why straight for philosophy.
Well, why separate out what... I mean, people think there's some sort of crisis. I don't see it that way. I don't think that there's been some sudden change. It's been an evolutionary change and a gradual shift. But, you can go back as far as you like into, old history, Greek and Roman times, and you can find evidence of people being concerned about what's real and what's not. But even within living memory, people have been arguing about what's real and what's not forever. What's different now is the technology by which facts are disputed and delivered and distributed and disseminated. So, it's the old saying that a lie can go around the world before the truth's got out of bed. That's what's different, the speed with which it can happen. I remember when the Gulf War happened, we were shocked to realise that a BBC reporter on the deck of an aircraft carrier in the Mediterranean could film a missile being fired at Baghdad, and we were watching it before it landed.
Wow.
Now, that's new. It used to be these things happened. Tamerlane went around taking people's heads off on the Silk Road years ago, but you didn't find out about it for a long time. So therefore you didn't know, and therefore you weren't frightened, scared. You weren't worried about the Crusaders because you didn't know that it had happened on the other side of the Mediterranean, or whatever period of history you want to look at. The Vietnam War was said to be the first war where television told us what was happening, and it immediately brought about a very emotional and gut response. And we've gone further since then. And now, and Gaza is the best example of a war being covered in real time that's created a global response against what people are seeing. Stuff like that's always happened. In fact, probably even more bloody, more brutal, more savage. You go back to the sort of medieval times and people were hung, drawn and quartered. Nobody saw it unless you were right there and seeing it then. Now we're seeing terrible things happen, and wars are horrible, but we're all sharing in the consumption of the imagery.
So the speed's changed, but also, as we've heard about in this series, the import of mistruths, which are negative, has changed. Their stickiness, if you like, the way they really dig in and how they've changed politics themselves. Mistruths are now part of a business model for many social media platforms and so forth. So that's what's changed as well, isn't it?
No, I think
it potentially has.
I don't think that's new. Look at the McCarthy era.
Mm-hmm.
That was full of mistruths about the threat of communism. And, sure, communism, I'm not saying it was a fairy tale and it was benign, but it wasn't as it was being portrayed. And so people's careers, their lives, their families, everything was disrupted. People were persecuted because they were thought to have even the most remote connection to an ideology. And a lot of that, and we know in the McCarthy era, a lot of it was wrong. People were executed. The Rosenberg trial, people were executed for what were perceived to be treacherous or seditious beliefs and activities that turned out not to be true. So this is not new. What's new is that we're finding out about it much quicker, much more clearly, and the polarisation, that's new, that polarisation that it triggers and that in some way it assists and amplifies, that's new. I mean, I don't think we've ever been as polarised as we are now. And when you look at some of the fundamental pillars of democracy, some of the bits that make it work, they're what's under stress and strain now.
I guess what I would want to talk about just before we move on to how it has really changed how we even have this political discourse, is that it's not just weaponised and powerful and politicised. It is also part and parcel of, it's monetised. Yep. It's part and parcel of business models of the very institutions that are disseminating it.
Yeah, you can make money out of telling a lie on a digital platform. You put ads embedded into it, and the more people buy the lie, the more money you make, which then encourages you to tell more lies. That's spectacular. You could always publish fiction before. You could always perpetrate a nonsense. I mean, people sold the supermarket penny dreadfuls about UFOs and aliens landing in the desert and the moon landing didn't happen. I mean, you made money out of those lies then, but you did it in a much less dramatic fashion and much less successful fashion. It didn't change the public dialogue the way it is now. It's penetrating the zeitgeist, don't you love that, much more than it ever has. So the gap between something that's established and scholarly and authentic and verified and what is circulating in the public mind, that's got bigger. It used to be some of this stuff, it was always there, but it was fringe and we knew it was fringe and it wasn't worth chasing every nonsense rabbit down every silly burrow. It was like, oh, we'll just leave them, they're harmless, who cares? They're no longer harmless, there's more of them and they're gaining traction. Now, what I think troubles me the most, and I don't know what other people have said in your series, but I hope someone's picked up on this, but what troubles me is that the good actors have turned out to be a bit flat-footed. The bad actors have turned out to be really creative. And at the moment, if the pendulum swings, it's swinging a bit their way. I'm confident, I'm not absolutely sure, but I'm confident it will swing back as conversations like this one we're having in Melbourne, Australia. These conversations are being held all around the world. Everyone's waking up, I think a little belatedly, but either way, people are now going, oh, okay, we actually have to do something about this. We have a challenge. Does democracy matter? I think so. But apparently a huge proportion of young people in Japan, for instance, don't, according to a survey that was done there not long ago. 30 to 40% of young Japanese think there might be a better way than democracy to run Japan. Voter turnout. We've had just 2024 was a year of extraordinary global elections. A huge proportion of the world's population that live in democracies had the chance just in 1 year to go to the polls. Notionally Russia, let's pretend, but the United States, India, Britain, France, a whole lot of other countries, Taiwan, countries had elections. Voter turnout in almost all of them was significantly down. Very few countries have compulsory voting like we do here in Australia. I think it's 19 countries in the world have compulsory voting, and even fewer enforce compulsory voting. So there are countries that have it, but they don't do anything about making it actually happen. We are one of a handful that enforce compulsory voting. And even here, voting levels and participation levels in democracy are down. Now, by participation, I don't just mean voting. Participating in democracy is a whole lot more than voting, although that's an important part. It means participating in civic society, volunteering, caring about your community, participating in community sport, not just sending the kids off and saying someone else can look after that, but going along, doing the oranges, helping out on the sidelines, whatever it might be. That's what those are the nuts and bolts of community. We've more and more outsourced it. And in fact, there's the whole, we can go on about the Karens and we can go on about, white line fever and all this sort of stuff, but it's all a syndrome of the same thing, which is someone else can do that. I'm really busy. I'm going to take my kids, drop them off, and then I'll go off and do something else rather than participate in, for instance, kids' sport, just as a tiny little example. There's a great saying, I've forgotten which American president it is, and I stand to be corrected, but I think it might be President Truman, who said, every concerned citizen needs to be a part-time politician if you want democracy to work. That's not an exact quote. That's sort of about what he said. And I think that's true. So most professional football clubs and sporting clubs have more members than our political parties now, and we've had a duopoly for a very long time. I think we're living in an era now where that duopoly is collapsing. The polarisation and the duopoly, really interesting that they're happening at the same time. I think it tells us something. People are looking for other ways of expressing what they care about in society.
So you're talking about, I guess, the connection between the fragmentation of community and also this sense of being disengaged from politics and civic society happening at the same time. But to what extent can politicians then, they may be responsible for part of this political disengagement and the disillusionment that leads people down rabbit holes and so forth. How willing do you think they are to do what they can to bring society together again?
Are you serious?
I just thought I'd ask the question to you. Tell me.
Professional politicians don't actually care about any of this. They say they do, but they actually only care about one thing, power. That's why they're there. They want power, either personally or collectively within their party, if they're in a party, or in a broader sense, they want to be in government. It's one of the great, sort of dilemmas of small parties and fragmentation of politics. But the main parties, the parties of government, as the Labor and Liberal parties like to talk about, but we're not like the Greens, for instance, or we're not like, some other fringe group, because we're a party of government. In other words, from time to time, we actually have to deliver. We've got to do it. We get our hands on the levers and we've got to do stuff and be accountable for it, as opposed to protest groups, protest parties, minor parties and so on, which we can come to if you want to. But the parties of government only care about power, about being in government.
Does that necessarily mean that we can't ever believe them?
No, it doesn't mean that at all. And ideally, and we see a few examples of this, you actually have the two things happening at the same time. But there are people in politics who don't care about anything else, and they will trash anything if it delivers power. Then there are people in politics who think the best way to have power is by entering into some trusting bond with the community, form that relationship, build on it. A lot of politicians are a bit like police. They start off with the best of intentions when they join the force, and then slowly over time the internal culture tends to get to them. Politicians are the same. They go in there, they're bright-eyed, bushy-tailed and full of idealism, and over time it wears them down. I've got an unpopular view that Australia's democracy would be better if we had term limits. I think 2's not enough, 3's the most, and that way you'll have people who go in, get shit done, get out. Now, a lot of professional politicians say, no, you could end up spending that whole time in opposition. I go, well, that's some even more urgency to what you're doing. But the idea that you can have a bobcatter or someone who's there forever and just rusted on, and we've seen what that's done in America. We've seen what it's done with, some of the problems in the UK. You get people who are just, that's their career, that's their life, that's their base, and they just never want to give it up. And they're not actually doing anything, they're just wielding influence and power, and I don't think it's particularly helpful.
That just increases the political class by, quite some factor.
Well, no, you get some turnover. And the other part of that is that at the moment you won't have people going into politics very often who have achieved something else in a professional life, and then they go into politics and want to give it 5-10 years or whatever, and then go back to what they're doing. Katie Allen's a good example. There's a couple of doctors, Monique Ryan's another one, both happening to be in Victoria, but I'm sure there are examples. I'm just maybe not familiar with them in other places. You sometimes get lawyers who dip out of a successful career, but by and large our political class are people who have come up as advisors to then graduate into being politicians themselves. I don't think that's particularly good, but that's the most common. With the National Party, of course, you get farmers, but they're mostly not active farmers, they're farmer politicians, or Barnaby Joyce, who's an accountant. But, you get people who make it their vocation and their career. And I think our political class would be better for more diversity and people who come in, give it a go and get out. So I'm a fan of fixed terms.
So that's a structural change that would, saying,
term
innately...
limits rather than fixed terms.
Yes. So that would potentially increase the trust that people have in the structure itself of government, because it would have those terms and that accountability, as you say.
Yeah, but it'll never happen because you're asking the people with power to give up their power.
They're not
going to do that.
So let's look at what else can increase trust in political discourse. Journalism.
Yeah, that's a fair way down my list.
Yep.
I think anti-corruption commissions, whistleblower protections, parliamentary scrutiny, and along with the Anti-Corruption Commission, other things like the state ombudsman, federal ombudsman, robo-debt should never have been allowed to happen if the process hadn't been kind of, contorted. And the media is in there as well, absolutely. It's the job of a strong, robust, independent media to hold power to account. That's the cliche. It occasionally happens and sometimes it doesn't.
So what's the connection, do you think, between the use of fear in politics and how that has actually changed politics around the world?
At the risk of getting some Novichok directed at me, I think there's a very clear thread between a lot of what's going on, Brexit, Trump, Marine Le Pen, the far right around the world, and we can go through all the autocrats in Turkey or wherever you want to look, and a lot of it is driven by a fear of migration, and a lot of that fear of migration is triggered by what's happened in a couple of countries driven by Russia and amplified by social media. So Cambridge Analytica, the Syrian war leaves Syria in absolute turmoil. Russia has worked out that they cannot compete with the West culturally, economically, militarily, or in any other way. So what do? You use the Achilles heel of democracy, its openness, to undermine it. And you do that by unleashing a wave of unwanted migration into European centres and countries, the wave of Middle Eastern refugees that disrupted politics in Holland, normally very tolerant, in France, in Germany, Angela Merkel, in Italy, North Africa, where the Wagner group, the mercenaries, are actively destabilising countries in Africa, unleashing wave after wave after wave of mostly young men seeking another life in Europe, and Europe totally unable and unprepared to deal with it. Inevitably, the reaction is going to be anti-immigration. That fosters the right-wing rise. We saw the same with Brexit, a panic about migration driving Brexit. It's turned out to be absolutely absurd and terrible for the UK. They're going to have to sort it out. Donald Trump did exactly the same thing with the people coming up through Central America and said, they're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats, and so on. Now, the role of Russia in this is amplifying it, and we've learned, we actually know established facts, not opinion. Some of this is opinion, but this is the fact bit. We know when you lift the veil that Russia is driving the social media amplification of these concerns. So if we see now the collapse of some of the proxies that Russia has been funding, it might all change, and fairly dramatically, once the world wakes up to it and does what it needs to do about it. So are people going to flood back into Syria? Are people going to suddenly leave the shanty towns and the tent cities in Paris and Amsterdam and so on, where they've been forced to try and scrape out an existence? I don't know. It's going to be fascinating to see, but I won't be at all surprised if Mr. Putin suddenly suffered the biggest setback in his big plan to destabilise and undermine the West.
Even if the geopolitics change and then those plans change, it's still going to take some time, and the democracies of the world are still going to have to cope with the social cohesion questions still. Totally. For some time. They're going to still have to cope with this idea of coping with the fear over immigration?
It's the stress test that democracy is now dealing with. This is putting what we thought were our values and our institutions to a stress test. I'm an optimist. I'm a glass half full person. I think we'll be okay, but there'll be some people hurt along the way.
Yeah, I do want to get to those institutional structures and the problems they face, actually, and the backlash they face by actually being fact checkers, if you like. But sticking with journalism for the moment, how you're now out of the game, you're sitting back, you're looking at this, you've got a long history of also looking at it while you've had the hot seat. How has the role of the media changed, and how do you see it sitting today in terms of holding politicians accountable to the truth?
This could cost me friendships.
Go for it.
No, it probably won't. But I mean, first point to make is that I never trained as a journalist.
You're proud of it?
Well, I'm not proud of it, but it does make my entry to and my existence within the media sort of sphere, within that ecosystem, it's a bit different. I didn't come up through a newspaper. I didn't get a cadetship at the ABC. I didn't come in as a sort of, aspiring, here we are at the scene of last night's crash kind of television person. I never did any of that stuff, and I don't understand quite why people do. You were a creature of all of that, but quite frankly, I had producers when I was on the radio for, 23 years doing the morning show. I had producers who wanted me on Friday morning to talk to a journalist standing outside a roller door where something happened on Thursday night. And I never understood why. And they'd say, because it's in the news. And I'd say, but why is it in the news? Who gives a shit this morning about what happened outside a roller door last night where someone got stabbed or hit on the head with a bottle or a car caught fire? That's not what matters. Oh, it's the news cycle. I said, yeah, but it shouldn't be. That's not actually what the audience want. That's what the people in the media have trained each other to think is the news. It's not. It's cat up a tree stuff. It's rubbish. It's not telling us anything about our world. So I was kind of never part of that ecosystem, that culture. I didn't come up through it. So it always left me a bit on the side, a bit on the outside. I wasn't, you said I was proud of it. No, I wasn't proud of it, but I was always first of all, I was respectful of people who did come through it because of the skills they had and I didn't have, and I had to learn those skills. But the mindset, I never really felt I adopted and was never particularly comfortable with. So having said all that, by way of parentheses to answer your question, I think the media is going through a bit of an existential crisis, and I think there are a lot of people in the media who are still doing what they were trained to do, but they were trained 20 years ago or 30 years ago, and the bosses are of that era, and they haven't understood how things have moved on. People want much more analysis. Why are you still doing things like stock market prices in the news? If anyone's actually interested in that, they've got it on their phone, right? They don't need to have a particular moment in the day at 20 past 7 or whatever it might be to be told something they've been monitoring all day. If they're running a self-managed super fund or they're in the world of business and all of that, they know what the FTSE's done and they know what the gold price is, and no one else gives a rat's.
But it's different for political journalists because a lot of people aren't looking necessarily at
Sure.
question time.
So I'm talking about how some of the givens, some of the kind of shibboleth, some of the supposed this is how you have to do things, I think are complete rubbish. And no one stopped to rethink it. Now, one of the things no one's sought to rethink, to come to the point of your question, is the difference between news and analysis. And I think that's run out of time too. Again, if you want news, there's 1,000 ways to find it out. You curate your own feed of news and information. What's really hard now is, what does that information mean? So we're speaking to each other a week after one of the most media savvy people I've ever met, who's now the chair of the board of the ABC, his name's Kim Williams, has ended up finding himself on the wrong end of a fight with a guy in America who runs a podcast that has 3 million subscribers called Joe Rogan, who is clearly more influential than the ABC could ever dream to be in his own marketplace. And the chairman of the board of the organisation you and I both worked for years and that I've bled for, has shown up the Achilles heel of Australian media, because there's no Joe Rogan in Australia. There are people who want to be and try to be, but no one's actually come up with the right source just yet. Source S-A-U-C-E, not S-O-U-R-C-E. And when they do, it's going to be very telling. So whether it's Clive Palmer throwing another couple of $1 million down saying, here, try this, try this, try this. There's so many wannabes. There's so many people trying it out. Someone's going to hit pay dirt on this in Australia and in the Australian market. My wish is that it would be the ABC that would do it, because then the pay is a community pay rather than an individual. But your old Alan Jones model, I will tell you what to think and you will all be disciples at the temple of Alan Jones, that worked for a while in that market. It never worked nationally, and he was, untouchable. He was given that power by politicians in New South Wales who quite literally came and tugged forelock. You might remember Malcolm Turnbull bucked against it. I will not take dictation from you, Alan Jones, he said when Alan was saying, write this down and go away and do it. And he said, I'm not taking dictation from you. I'm the Prime Minister of Australia. But there were plenty of others, in particular on the Conservative side of politics, who did do exactly that. But what we're going to get is we're going to get someone at some point is going to be able to find that little spot, that tiny little crevice, and they'll be sufficiently credible and sufficiently entertaining to build that kind of a base.
But would it be someone from legacy media? Because
who knows?
What occurs to me is that legacy media is facing the same sort of headwinds as these institutional structures.
Yep.
They're seen as old and, as you say, patronising and, telling people what to think, and are ipso facto not trustworthy. We saw during COVID the attack on legacy media as by a minority of people, but it is, I see very much parallels between that and the way in which an electoral commission is being attacked by an ombudsman, CSIRO, all drawn into identity politics, culture wars, etc., facing the same, basically the people who are supposed to be right and keeping everyone to account and putting guardrails around society themselves are becoming politicised. How do we get around that?
I think you lean into it rather than away from it. Part of what you do is you wheel out your Sharon Lewin when people say, you might not want to get vaccinated, it might be dangerous and it could be blowing your brain up or whatever nonsense they come up with. And you go, okay, we've pretty much got rid of typhus, leprosy, whooping cough, malaria, all of these sorts of things. And how did we do it? We did it with vaccines. You don't know what you're talking about. There are people here at the university who have spent decades learning this stuff. They actually know what they're talking about. If you want to do that, go and do your own brain surgery as well.
But is that...
And, you've got to fight fire with fire. You've got to treat... You can't... One of the things, and I've done some of this work at the university. I work there part-time, and one of the recurring themes I have is that you can't fight an anecdote with data. Doesn't work. You've got to fight an anecdote with an anecdote. You've got to learn, what are these people thinking, the people who are vaccine skeptics. We have to get onto their wavelength rather than wag a finger at them and say, you're really, really ignorant, you don't know what you're talking about. Here is a chart about our research. That's never going to work.
There is a school of thought that misses a shift in tone, and potentially it's a generational thing. I agree with you. I think that should definitely work. But we saw that in COVID in particular, it didn't work.
No, it
and
did.
That some people would,
we had some of the highest vaccination rates in the world.
In terms of convincing someone who is already not...
Sure, we had a few people who were panicked and sceptical. I'll give you a really quick example. At the start of COVID, there was an advertising campaign by most of the state governments, and they would have the chief health officer or an eminent infectious diseases doctor in a white coat with a stethoscope around their neck, looking down the barrel of a camera and saying, wash your hands, put on a mask, and we can stop this thing in its tracks. And it wasn't working. I lost my cool. I just left the ABC and I still was sort of, my brain was still working at that pace, even though I didn't have an outlet for all that energy. But I contacted someone I'd done a lot of work with over the years, who was the person in charge of comms within the health department here in Victoria. And I just sent her a message and said, oh, please, can we do better than that? Nurses and doctors wagging their fingers and telling people not to be naughty is never going to persuade people. You need to do herograms. And she wrote back and said, I am rather busy. Can you get out of my way? But what are you talking about? What are herograms? And I said, you need to work out what are the particular groups in the community that aren't doing what you want. So if it's tradies, you've got to get someone who tradies respect and will listen to, a football star or someone like that. If it's, and going through what are the different demographic groups that you're not getting through to. It's not about getting through to nice middle class, well-educated people in the burbs. They're doing what they're told. It's everybody else we're worried about.
Trusted community members.
Yeah,
We
so,
have talked about this in the
but
series.
segmented, not just a trusted community member, but what are the specific groups? And so it turned out that next generation migrant men, in particular from the Middle Eastern and African communities, were not getting the message. It turned out tradies, young tradie, thinks they're bulletproof. They always do. That's why they, drive like lunatics, just like I used to. Well, don't know about you, but I'm lucky to be alive. So how do we get through to young tradies? How do we get through to, and so on? There were different groups in the community. And so she wrote back and said, well, these are the groups we can't get through to. And I said, then we need to find people that they respect, that they listen to, and will help them with a touch of humour.
Absolutely.
She said, what are you talking about? And so I wrote her an email. She said, can you put it down as a proposal? So I wrote a proposal. Literally, this is all within the space of little more time than it takes to tell this story. It was frantic. And I wrote and I said, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to ask, get Magda Szubanski to do a kind of Sharon netball player one. We need to get someone from MasterChef to get through to the demographic who love MasterChef. We ended up with, so to cut the long story short, they commissioned me to make these ads. Matt Preston, Magda Szubanski, Shane Jacobson, get through to the tradies, get Shane, Kenny, under the bonnet of an old Holden saying, you know what, if it's, and the tagline was the old condom gag, if it's not on, it's not on, holding up a mask.
Yes.
Right? And so
it was a terrific ad.
So we did 6 of these, and they were targeting specific groups. And literally overnight, they were put out on social media. They were eventually shown on TV. They were put on social media, and they had millions of views in the space of a week.
You've just proved my point. This is what I'm saying. This is the new way of potentially getting through, is not through the scientists wagging the finger. It is about getting in early, as has been pointed out in this series, making sure that you're getting to where people live, but also through those trusted voices. And moving away from the institutions. This is to draw back to the fact checkers, the politicised fact checkers, and even the idea of needing to address these mistruths after they're out, but really getting at them before they form.
As they form.
They form.
Yeah, and you've got to be agile and nimble. But the bureaucracy was extraordinary here. Normally, I was told, if the state health department was going to do a public health ad campaign, it would be 6 months in the preparation. There would be endless consultants. It would be millions of dollars, and it would be a massive thing. We did this. We made 6 ads in 2 weeks. We got approval by filming a rehearsal with me on FaceTime with the person in the health department on an iPhone watching the rehearsal, and she would say, can you just change this word, or no, we need a different emphasis. We winged it, and we did it on the run. I got my son's best friend was making ads for grog companies, and I said, quick, you've got nothing else to do, everyone's locked down. We've got an exemption. We had permits to be able to move around and film these things. Can you put together a crew? And we just went for it. In 2 weeks, we made 6 ads, and then they released them, and they went absolutely nuts. They went viral.
Listening to you, I'm wondering whether...
Sorry, because they were funny.
That's exactly the point I was going to bring up.
So Matt Preston did this incredible magic trick with a napkin in a closed, mothballed restaurant down at South Bank, which belonged to my ex-producer's partner. And we said, can you open for a day so we can come in? Don't take the tablecloths off the chairs and tables. Keep it like it's closed. And Matt sitting at a table with a napkin tucked in around his neck with the dead restaurant behind saying, we want these to come back. Here's what you've got to do. And then he did this magic trick with his napkin and stared down the barrel and said, wear a mask, wash your hands, and then we can get back to fine dining again. And so on. And there was Michelle Payne and Stevie, the Melbourne Cup winning jockey, couple of Moana Hope.
That's right.
Female footballer. Took her about 10 goes to kick the goal at the end of her one, but she got there eventually.
I'm sure that should have been in an
Walid
NGA.
Ali and Nazim Hussain on stage at the Melbourne Town Hall, taking the piss out of each other and so on. So there were particular groups that were targeted, each one of these, and it worked. It just did.
What this brings to mind is that we've talked a lot about the power of fear when it comes potentially to mistruths that generally do the stickiest ones, if you like, really using fear as a way of getting through to people. Is humour the antidote? You seem to be saying, like, I can see that very much as that path through someone's bias or preconceptions could be humour, as well as trusting the source.
Yeah, being human. It's not so much about the humour, it's about being authentic and being sincere and being believable, being a trusted source. So, if you were we tried to get Shane Warne for that series. He was in England for the Ashes. He agreed to do it. And at the last minute, one of his other contracted media companies said they weren't comfortable with him doing that because that was just as the sort of vaccine scepticism blowback was getting going. And he said, they said, we'd rather you didn't do it. You'll alienate some of the audience. We don't want them thinking, oh, Shane's one of them. A few other people said no, including some people from the world of rock and roll, who I was a bit disappointed that they said, oh, no, we don't want to take a stance. And I went,
well, are they trusted anyway?
Yes, this person very much was.
Okay.
But we had a wish list. We got nearly everybody, and people either did it for nothing or next to nothing, and they did it at the drop of a hat. And the great irony of it all is, of course, I've never made an ad in my life, and I've worked for an organisation that doesn't sell ads, although it makes it about itself. But it was instinct. It was just, we know what we need to do. Let's just do it. And I'm rather proud of it, actually. When I look back, I haven't really talked about this much before, but I'm rather proud of it because it helped to play a role. Just out of you've got to do this. It's in the public interest. Come on, pull your finger out.
That was a moment in time where it was such a social experiment, wasn't it, in terms of communication and trust and engagement. Yeah. Outside of a pandemic situation where people literally, have not much more to do than to consume stuff like that. You've talked about politicians, structure change, whatever, but how does politics itself heal itself in terms of trust? How do progressive voices in particular, or people who might not want to use, let's not say progressive, let's say anyone who doesn't want to go down a divisive path or using mistruths, and that could be on both sides of the politics, obviously. How do they get the cut through? How does that change?
I'm going to undo the premise of your question. Okay. When you say both sides, I don't think we've got both sides implies that polarisation, the duopoly.
Yes, it does.
And I actually think that's fallen apart. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about both sides, in fact, we're going to be talking about, polygons or, hexagons rather than just two sides in future. And I won't be at all surprised if at the looming federal election, neither party can form a majority in its own right. And it'll be a bit like we've seen in several state elections where you've got two minorities wooing the crossbench. And they'll be inviting the crossbench. You'll have a beauty parade. Now, what's going to happen here is you're going to have not just the Teals, Greens, other community independents, some of which are traditionally on the right and some are traditionally on the left, but they are going to have to work out a way of coexisting, and someone will need to be guaranteed supply under some form of loose agreement. So we're likely to end up a bit like New Zealand or maybe other countries where you form coalitions of convenience and you hope you can see out a term and you can cement some sort of working arrangement in place. Whether that's going to be lasting or not will depend on how successfully they can run the country that way. So Julia Gillard was a minority government. She got a lot done, extraordinary things done. They got the NDIS going, the Royal Commission into sexual abuse in institutions, which was quite extraordinary, quite apart from the misogyny speech, which was a moment in time, but the other things were lasting and ongoing and changed the country forever, quite apart from all the economic measures and job creation, all the other things as well. So, You can have a successful minority government, and we've seen them at state levels in different places at different times too. And the old way of doing things, on which our constitution was based at federation, which contemplated in the English fashion a government and an opposition, I think you're going to see that probably for quite a while go away. You'll get some strong groupings within independents. So, for instance, the Teals are staunchly and fiercely personally independent, but they cooperate with each other because they share some sort of values. But there's other things. Some of them are fairly conservative, some are quite progressive, but they share a value, and so they stay together. You've got the Voices of, which overlaps in the Venn diagram with the Teals. You're going to have some Greens probably. I mean, you've got some in the lower house. You'll probably still have some. And you might get some others as well, popping up, either single issue candidates or people who are thrown out of parties for being naughty or whatever it might be. And you could end up with a sizable crossbench that need to be wooed for governments to get stuff done. I won't be at all surprised if that's where we end up.
So does that process that, potentially in the Colesworths of parties might create panic and, talk of chaos and, lack of stability?
Well, that's what they say because they have an interest.
What they say, exactly.
That's their vested interest in
and which
trying
Europeans don't buy into.
Frightening people into coming back to them. But I think that's completely misconceived because people are running away from them because they've tried it, they bought it, they tried it and didn't like it and said, I'm not going to get sucked into that again. So while they're failing to deliver on whatever it is they're promising, people will they'll look around for alternatives and they'll say, go away.
So I just wonder how what you're describing as possible outcome sounds like it would potentially re-engage people, have them trust politicians more because they're choosing another option, obviously, that they feel where their interests are more aligned, their engagement is therefore higher. But doesn't it also potentially, how does that play against what you were talking about before, where we'll see the sausage being made much more, where there'll be much more robust discussion of, as you say, trade-offs. Do trade-offs help trust in the political process, or do they make people more cynical?
No. I think what you need to do to restore trust is actually deliver on what you say.
There's that.
How about that?
Yeah.
Give people what they were told they were going to get. 8 years on, we've had 8 years of inquiries into war crimes in Afghanistan. No one's been prosecuted. In Victoria, we had the Gobbo scandal where we had a barrister who was a police informer who was representing people without them knowing that she was a police informer. And there are people who were involved in covering it up at all levels. No one has. There was a Royal Commission. It's been a massive scandal, a crisis in the criminal justice system, the likes of which we've never seen. No one has been held to account for it, despite what we've learned. Robo-debt. The Anti-Corruption Commission goes, no, we didn't think we could achieve much there. It's all been done. We'll move on from that. Well, no. There's a deterrent effect in actually chasing some of those people until they are punished and dealt with. It's not just a matter of saying it's already been done, we're churning over old ground. It's actually about taking that to its end conclusion, to its final resolution, to send the message to everybody that's not acceptable. I could keep going. There's any other number of things where people go, what's going on here? You have to hold people to account. So if you want to restore trust, how about doing things that people want to see done to hold people who are bad to account, rather than letting them go away because it's all a bit too hard or it's all a bit taking too long, it's a bit too expensive, whatever else. So actually deliver on some of this accountability stuff. Strengthen the anti-corruption commissions and make them actually do things. Strengthen whistleblower protection so that people can say, you know what, I've just been told by my boss to lie and that's not acceptable. Morally, it's against my code and I don't want to get sacked for doing it. My boss is the one who should get sacked. Now, there are people who misuse that, and you've got to make sure not every whistleblower is a hero. I mean, there's someone in jail at the moment who calls themselves a whistleblower. In fact, they're not. And they're just someone using the whistleblower lever to try and get away from their own naughtiness. So that you can't let that sort of thing happen either. Your integrity commissions are absolutely crucial. Your parliamentary inquiries are absolutely crucial. Your members of parliament having a solid community base and then hearing what people ask them to do and doing it. Gambling ads. How can anybody in the parliament be saying there isn't a desire to wind back gambling ads, but the power of the gambling companies and their donations to people's campaigns are stopping any action? Well, if you want to restore faith, tell them to take a jump and limit gambling ads during kids watching time and sport games. Simple. Just actually do what needs to be done, and then people might start to trust you a little more.
Are you confident that the trust in political discourse will rise over time? Is this just all part of a cycle? We'll get through this sort of period of innate scepticism and not believing what you see?
I think the public are getting to the point of saying, we'll keep trying different things until we find something that works for us, not for you. Now, if politicians think, we can't get away with that anymore, we're going to actually have to deliver, then yes, you will. And if the main parties aren't any longer responsive to what they say are their values and their constituencies, they're going to get thrown out. We've seen huge swings, volatile swings in state elections, local government elections, New South Wales and Victoria. We're seeing the pendulum shift much more than it traditionally has. And I think people are getting a bit bolshy and saying, I'm not prepared to have the wool pulled over my eyes anymore. You either deliver or I'll throw you out.
Jon Faine, I could talk to you all day, but we've run out.
I think we have.
I could still talk longer. Thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. For more episodes, check out our website at scanloninstitute.org.au.